The oldest instrument are human beings themselves. Their buccal cavity was the organ of their earliest utterances of a reflexive, unconscious proto-paleophonal language, which produced some forms of intonations to express meaning. Additionally to the conveying of this reflexive and unconscious phonal language, expressing pain and pleasure, came the expression of a conscious, intentional request, evolving into a means of communication. Then much later in the process of their evolution, probably as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, they would have noticed that the string of their hunting bow, one of their probable inventions, generated a sound after an arrow was released, or simply when they plucked the string. But of course this would be audible only to the hunter. But as they brought the bow closer to their ear, they heard that the sound became louder, and found that if they bit one extremity of the bow between their teeth or even the string, the sound became even much louder because it was sent directly into the inner ear via the eustachian tube, with skull bones as a cavity of Helmholtz resonator. The variations of the mouth aperture while plucking the string with fingers or striking it with the string produced distinctive tone colors. This was the first monophonic instrument, producing only one pitch, but a pitch with a wide range of tonal colors, as with the African, the South American mouth bow still played today, as well as with the so-called Jew's harp. Then with time, man discovered that if they emulated the mouth cavity with a gourd, such as this one, which they use as a water container for drinking during hunting, and placed it on the bow with empty, the sound was even louder than with the original mouth bow, both mouth and gourd being what is known as Helmholtz resonators. Furthermore, they could vary the aperture of the gourd by pressing its opening onto their chests at different angles for variations of tone colors. They would have discovered that they could generate various pitches by shortening the string length of the bow by applying a thick stick at chosen places on the string, thus modifying the speaking length of the string. With time, the bow was straightened and the gourd was replaced by a hollow reed, which became the sound box, used as a cavity resonator for the vibrating string. The string was tied at both ends with the bridge placed at a chosen location, allowing to vibrate freely. The first lute was invented. In Sumer, in the Middle East, the musical bow would have been called bantur, textually bow small, to distinguish it from the large hunting bow, which would have been the Bengal or bow large. Progressively, the resonance cavity of the reed lute increases volume when the gourd, the same as the gourd of the bantur, was affixed to a straight neck, which became the fingerboard, as this replication of a gourd lute, which was played at the Uruk period, that is, to the Old Assyrian Babylon periods around 2000, from 2900 BC to about 2200 BCE. The gourd was covered with a lamb raw hide. The seminal soundboard covered the resonance cavity, along with a bridge here and a nut. Strings made from twisted lamb's guts were stretched along the straight neck and tuned by means of a primitive system which is still in usage to this day in many world ethnical groups. Then a monoxide lute was produced, as here. It was made from a long calabash, which grow naturally in the Middle East, where the bulbous part was cut open and an animal hide glued to it as soundboard. At about the same time, we have evidence from ancient Egypt during the 18th dynasty of lutes with tortoise shells as resonance cavities. They were also covered with animals' raw hide. With time, the tuning device was replaced by tuning pins, as we have them in North African copies of the Egyptian paradigm. From ancient Egypt of the 18th dynasty, we observe the presence of frets or fret marks, which suggests that a well-established tonal system was in usage over 3,000 years ago, perhaps more. The position of frets from extant models and from the iconography was provided us with an insight on the nature of scales used at that period. Two distinct tunings were noticeable. The first was the Proto- or Paleo-Zalzalian system, with neutral seconds, thirds, and sixths, and a natural scaling based on natural harmonics. However, we must emphasize that the presence of frets on string instruments often suggests dictatorships. The absence is evidence of freedom, as it allows for a wider variety of tonal nuances that fixed frets cannot allow. Now, if you go back to the Uruk period, that is between 3,200 and 2,200 years BC, an instrument developed from the original curved bow, taken from a calabash with a bulbous resonance cavity covered with a soundboard of raw hide, but in this instance fitted with 3 or more strings. This was the seminal harp, as we have it here. During the same period, the straight neck lute was fitted with a second neck. A yoke was fixed at the top, and several strings were stretched from the yoke to the base of the instrument. This was the generative line, as we have it here. Second, we have 2 necks, a yoke, and a few strings. Here we are. Now, whole pipes would have developed from a single pitch pipe, when the position of fingers on the reed lute would have been copied as holes on the reed with a mouthpiece, or the emplacement where the player blew his instrument was set as the emplacement of the nut of the instrument. Now, coming back to the early tambour, we contend that the Sumerian was used as the metathesis of tambour and became eventually the Greek pandura, panduros, panduris, or pandurion, the Latin pandura, etc. Linguists do not always agree with my hypothesis, which I have labeled as the drunkard sailor syndrome. It would be plausible that a drunk musician sailor, landing in a foreign country, called his instrument tambour instead of bantur, and then the word remained etched in the collective memory. The Akkadian for bantur is kashtu tilpanu. The lute, the gishgudi, gish being the determinative meaning made of wood. However, the determinative was only used in lexical text, but in practical usage, the instrument was known as the gudi. That it found its origins with Bantu may be hypothesized from the etymology of both syllables. On the one hand, the small arch harp, the Bantu, which may have kept the same name after the straightening of its neck, eventually led to Pandura, and on the other hand, the Gude would have become the Rot, Rota, Kroth, or the Oud, Laut, Laude, and Lute.